I'm Ezra Levan. Welcome to The Source. Remember this? The fate of one of the rioters at Calgary's pro-Hamas rally last spring has been decided, but does the punishment fit the crime? Later, we get reaction from the family that was attacked. Climate change hysteria.
Since temperature records began in 1880, the global average has increased by 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit.
NASA has since backtracked away from this so-called science. Coming up, we look to Dr. Benny Pizer exposing how desperate the left truly is. Maclean's magazine calls Winnipeg Canada's most racist city, but the facts just don't add up.
Do you believe that her death was a racist crime?
I just don't think we know exactly what happened.
Tonight, we expose the truth behind Canada's so-called racism problem. It's the straight talk you won't find anywhere else, only on The Source. So Maclean's magazine of Toronto published a cover story calling Winnipeg the most racist city in Canada. Here's a look at the cover. It's an Aboriginal woman repeating insults she says she hears. And the punchline at the bottom is Canada has a bigger race problem than America, and it's ugliest in Winnipeg. Inside, it gives another version of that headline, quote, "Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst." And then again in the second headline says, Winnipeg has a festering race problem. And just in case any of this is too subtle for you, here's what the author herself, Nancy MacDonald, wrote about Winnipeg. Quote, "It is quickly becoming known for the subhuman treatment of its First Nations citizens who suffer daily indignities and appalling violence. Winnipeg is arguably becoming Canada's most racist city." Subhuman? Indignities? Most racist? Wow. Now, I'm a Western boy, and my mom's from Winnipeg, and my dad went to school there too, but I won't claim to know Winnipeg too well. But I do know a few things about it, like this fact. Just a few months ago, Winnipeg had its election for mayor, and Brian Bowman, the guy who came in first with 48% of the vote, he's Métis. And Robert Falcon-Ouellette, the guy who came in third with 16% of the vote, he's Aboriginal too. So that's 64% of the voters voting for Aboriginal candidates right there. Now, that doesn't sound racist to me. And by the way, the second place candidate, Judy Washilishilis, the former NDP member of parliament, is about as pro-Aboriginal as you can get for a white woman, and she got 25% of the vote. So seriously, that's nearly 90% of the city voting for either Aboriginal candidates or a social justice warrior who packed her campaign platform with pro-Aboriginal policies. This is nothing new, actually. Manitoba has been electing Aboriginal members of parliament since the 1870s. I mean, this is the province of Louis Riel, after all. I know that's exotic for a magazine based in Toronto, but it's true. Winnipeg, right now, has two sitting Aboriginal MPs. A Métis man named Rod Bernouge, elected back in 2006 in Winnipeg South, and Shelley Glover, elected in 2008 in St. Boniface. So a quarter of the 8 ridings in town have Aboriginal MPs. Both are conservative, by the way, and Shelley Glover is actually in cabinet. Oh, and then there's the chief judge of the provincial court in Manitoba, the boss. Ken Champagne is his name, Métis man. But Maclean's magazine, based in Toronto, with a writer who lives in Toronto, says Winnipeg is racist. I mean, it could be. I'm not from Winnipeg. Do I really know? I live in Toronto these days. Oh, by the way, here's a picture of Toronto City Council. Toronto's population is about half visible minority, but out of 44 city councillors and a mayor elected last fall, just 6 are minorities. And then there's Maclean's magazine itself. On their website, they helpfully have pictures of all 40 of their writers. One man is Asian and one man is South Asian, and so that's 2 people out of 40 writers who are minorities. No blacks, no Aboriginals. I mean, I'm not saying they're racist. I'm just saying over at Maclean's, do they even know what a minority looks like? Just asking, when was the last time an Aboriginal journalist was published in Maclean's magazine? Just asking. But look, one privileged white woman in Toronto talked to another privileged white woman in Winnipeg, and they agreed. Winnipeg was the worst. Here, you got to read this. This is a proof point in this Maclean's cover story, and I quote, "Winnipeggers engage in a bizarre dance," says city author and educator Joanne Seif, who moved to Winnipeg in 2009 with her husband, a genetics professor. They are aware and sensitive to race as long as the person isn't Aboriginal. In 2009, shortly after arriving from Kentucky, she attended a neighborhood potluck. There, some guests launched into a scary diatribe against the city's Indigenous population. So a white woman who just moved up here from Kentucky 5 years ago, whose expertise is in knitting. Seriously, here's one of her knitting books called Fiber Gathering, and here's one of her books called Knit Green, 20 Projects and Ideas for Sustainability. So this white liberal knitting expert comes up from Kentucky about 5 years ago. She says she goes to a potluck dinner 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and heard someone saying something she doesn't quote, but she remembers it was scary, and so there you have it. Beyond a reasonable doubt, any jury would convict Winnipeg of being racist, right? And this is Canada's news magazine of record. Now, Nancy MacDonald did speak with some real Aboriginal people, probably very exciting for someone from Maclean's, and they shared with her various insults they have been called over the years. And no doubt what they reported was true. But is that enough to condemn a city as racist? As if that's some sort of science by asking a half dozen political activists for their anecdotes? Is that proof? Well, Nancy MacDonald talks about poverty, too, in her article, and about children in foster care. And it's true that Aboriginals in Canada, in every province, are worse off than the non-Aboriginal population by many measures. Social problems, substance abuse, crimes and violence. I'll talk more about that later. But this story in Maclean's wasn't called Winnipeg, one of Canada's poorest cities, or Winnipeg, one of Canada's worst cities for crime, or social dysfunction. It wasn't an investigation into a problem. It was a conclusion, an explanation for those social ills: racism. As in all the problems, from poverty to alcoholism to homelessness to crime to unemployment, those problems come from a moral failure in the white population. Those problems are the result of racism, and Winnipeggers are the worst in the country at that moral flaw. Now look, every population has its racism and bigotry. Every city, every ethnic group does, by the way, including Aboriginal people. We're all sinners. But Maclean said the sin of racism was particularly rampant in Winnipeg. But did they have any proof other than their own Toronto preconceptions? Well, I've read their 6,000-word smear, and here's the paragraph that I think comes closest to trying to scientifically prove that Winnipeg is more racist than anywhere else. Here, I'll read it to you. Ready? Get this. Winnipeg recorded the highest proportion of racist tweets of the 6 Canadian cities known for high levels of hate crime, according to data collected by University of Alberta researcher Irfan Chowdhury. So tweets on Twitter, that's your proof? In cities known for hate crime. What, as in mean tweets? Well, I checked out the researcher, Irfan Chowdhury. He's even got a website called twitterracism.com. I can hardly wait for the iPhone app. It's pretty much the perfect pitch for applying for government research grants, don't you think? He's going to study Twitter racism for a living. Well, besides his website, he published what's called a poster in research. It explains his work. He checked Twitter for the number of times any people at random in several Canadian cities used 5 different racist words. He searched for the word Paki, P-A-K-I, on Twitter. I know it sounds odd that he did this as part of his PhD work, but he did. Listen, welcome to what universities are all about these days. So he searched for the word Paki, sorry to say it, the word chink, C-H-I-N-K. I'm sorry I'm saying these words, I'm just explaining what he did. He searched for the words white trash. He searched for the N-word. Sorry, I'm not going to say that one. And then finally, he searched for another N-word, native. Seriously, do you see a problem right there already? Right there, built into this study of surfing strangers' Twitter accounts to see if they're using derogatory words. He says the word native is derogatory. Yes, sorry, it's not. So he randomly grabbed 776 uses of all these words, as if the word native was rude, as if it were the same as the other N word. And here's what he found. He studied Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and Winnipeg, or as Maclean calls them, Canadian cities known for hate crimes. And what did he find? Well, he found that by far the most racist city in Canada is, Toronto, where the N-word, the real N-word, was used 190 times, and the word Paki was used 100 times. A total of 434 bad words were counted from Toronto, a city of 2.5 million people. And in Winnipeg, a city of 770,000 people, only 78 bad words were used, and that's if you include the word native as a bad word, which it's not. So in fact, only 44 bad words, or about 1/10 as many, the number said in Toronto, were said in Winnipeg. Now, you'll probably agree with me, calling this a credible study is stretching the term. Some guy randomly checks random Twitter accounts for only certain bad words of his choosing, and he chooses some really weird words, and that's proof of racism in the city, apparently. But even given how goofy this study is, does it do what Maclean said it did? Does it show that Winnipeg is the most racist city out of 6 top hate crime cities in Canada? No, it does not. Not even if you think the word native is mean. Toronto, even with its larger population, had more mean words said, and real mean words, the real N-word. Did Maclean's even fact check this article? Was it even edited? If someone says, I can prove an entire city is racist by using this one weird Twitter trick, doesn't your BS detector start going ping, 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 ping? Did anyone look at this cockamamie study of tweets before using it as proof that Winnipeggers are racist? Well, don't go away, because I'm not done doing some fact checking of my own. Is Winnipeg racist? Come back after the break to find out. So Maclean's magazine publishes a story with the headline, Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst. Is it? Well, I've already showed you the Twitter study they used is flawed and bizarre, but how about this? Here, Maclean spoke to the former Director of Education on the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, that's an Indian band, and he said that the white government just didn't fund Indian kids at school the same way that white kids were treated. Here, let me quote. He couldn't keep qualified teachers on reserve. He doesn't blame them. If they drove a mile down the road to teach at the school in the provincial system, they'd earn $10,000 more per year. The problems of underfunding have been well documented. Federally funded reserve schools receive 40% of the funding that non-reserve schools do, amounting to a per-child gap of $2,000 to $3,000. Many reserve schools don't have libraries. 1 in 3 doesn't even have running water. Well, that does sound pretty racist. I mean, why would the evil Stephen Harper give less money to Aboriginal kids for school than to white kids? And as the Toronto Reporter says, it's being well documented, so she doesn't have to document it in her story because we know it's all well documented, right? Well, I took 60 seconds on Google looking for this documentation, and here's what I found. This was published 18 months ago by the Department of Indian Affairs in Manitoba. The per-student spending on Aboriginal school kids was $12,868. That's federal Indian Affairs money, $12,868. And the amount of money spent by the province on all schools at the same time worked out to $11,473 per kid. So the feds were actually spending about $1,400 more per year on Aboriginal students in Manitoba than on non-Aboriginal students. More, not less. Okay, well, maybe that's not how it is on the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. Maybe it's really bad on that reserve. Well, the big school on that reserve is called the Joe A. Ross School. Here's a picture of it. It looks pretty big and modern. Here's a shot of the grade 6 computer class, flat screen monitors. Here's an English class, looks big and bright and modern. Here's a shot of the gym, looks pretty good. I mean, that's the school. The band website says there are 771 kids at that school. Okay, so how much money is this school getting? Well, let's do some research. I mean, I'm in Toronto too, But I hopped online, and in about a minute or two, I found these audited financial statements from the band. They're about a year old. They show $2.3 million for education facilities, plus $7.9 million for elementary and secondary educational services. So that's $10.2 million a year. Okay, and they say they have 771 kids there, so that works out to $13,229 per kid. Like I said, the spending per pupil in the rest of the province is just over $11,000. The school looks good to me, actually, so why did Maclean say it was so awful? And they specifically spoke about this Indian band. This Indian band's a bit famous, though, because its chief happens to be the highest paid Indian chief in all of Manitoba, $130,000 a year tax-free, which is the equivalent of making $200,000 a year off the reserve. So the chief of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, which has about 4,500 band members, about 1,500 homes, earns more than the mayor of Winnipeg or the premier of Manitoba. Racism, though, racism, you see. See, the racist, if you say it, maybe you'll sell a lot of magazines, right, Maclean's? Okay, well, what about crime? Maclean's uses the word murder 13 times in their story about racism in Winnipeg. And it's true, Winnipeg has a heavy crime problem, and it is disproportionately Aboriginal, both the perpetrators and the victims of crime. Here's how Maclean says it, and I quote, "The homicides that plague the city, earning it the nickname Murder Peg, and the country's highest rate of violent crime, are a primarily North End phenomenon." North End is where a lot of Aboriginal people are in Winnipeg. Now, that's true. And I'm going to deal with the elephant in the room here before I'm done, the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. I'll get back to that issue, I promise. But first, I just want to show you more about how Maclean's reports things versus the facts. So, obviously, things are just getting worse in Winnipeg. I mean, racism, right? Well, about that, see, here's the racist police chief of Winnipeg. Yeah, he's a black man named Devin Clunas. Most racist city in Canada, eh? Hey, Maclean's, can you let me know when Toronto gets a black police chief? Maybe you can get one of your black writers to write about it. Psych. But maybe Chief Clunas is a racist himself. I mean, we're all sinners. Has he neglected the problem of crime that so disproportionately affects Aboriginals? Well, here's what Statistics Canada has to say. This is a chart of what police call the Crime Severity Index. Basically, every crime is given a certain numerical weight, depending on how serious it is, measured by sentencing. So a murder would count much more than a robbery, which would count much more than shoplifting. Look at Manitoba. It's the middle there, but it's still too high. But look on the right side. The Violent Crime Severity Index in Manitoba fell by nearly 13 points last year. The biggest decline of any province. Let me say that again. Manitoba's violent crime severity fell more than any other provinces did last year. So much so that it's almost now down to Saskatchewan levels. I mean, in the past 5 years, violent crime has declined 21%, and property crime is down 33% in Winnipeg. I wonder if Maclean's knew that, or if they just ignored it because it didn't suit their preconceptions. They were out to prove that a city with a Métis mayor and a black police chief was Canada's most racist city, and so, of course, crime would be getting worse for Aboriginals, right? Don't tell Maclean's, but in Toronto, there have been 17 shootings so far in Toronto in 2015. That's up from 11 shootings at this same point in the year in 2014. So as you can see, shootings are up 54% in Toronto, and the number of shooting victims is up 61% in Toronto. Now, I'm sure that will level off pretty soon. I mean, we don't want to have to send some Winnipeg reporters out to Toronto to call Toronto Canada's most violent city, do we? Blame the white police chief and the white mayor for racism or something? Now, I'm almost done. After the break, I want to talk about the real problem here. The low education levels, broken homes, drug and alcohol addiction, violence, unemployment. Those are real problems. So how does Maclean's magazine address them? What are their solutions? I'll tell you next. So Maclean's magazine published a cover story on Winnipeg's racism problem. They call the city the most racist city in Canada, but that's not true. But I want to talk with you about the real problem in Winnipeg because, of course, there is a real problem, or a bundle of them, actually. Low education levels for Aboriginal people, broken homes, drug and alcohol addiction, violence, unemployment, and those are real problems. And depending on how you measure those problems are indeed as bad or worse than the problems faced by U.S. blacks, as Maclean says. It's true, Aboriginal Canadians have a lot of problems, but Maclean's isn't interested in truly examining those problems because that's hard. And it's politically incorrect to emphasize something that was tucked away way down in the Maclean story, long past the part most folks would stop reading the 6,000-word monstrosity. And I'll quote, the one significant thing in the whole magazine article that you'd have to read deep down before you got to it. Let me read the one thing in Maclean's. Just 8% of Aboriginal women are killed by strangers. The majority are murdered by their spouses or boyfriends, 40%. Family members, 23%. Or acquaintances, 30%. In other words, see, Maclean's didn't quite come out and say it. In other words, the greatest predators and violators and murderers of Aboriginal women are Aboriginal men. I'm sorry, I hate saying those painful words because it sounds like an accusation, but it's not. It's just a statistic compiled by police who actually solve 88% of the murders of Aboriginal women across Canada. The RCMP published more statistics, too, that Maclean's didn't find room to include. For example, 44% of the murderers of Aboriginal women are drunk at the time, triple the rate of murderers of non-Aboriginal women. 74% of the murderers are unemployed. 71% already have a criminal record. 53% had been convicted before of a violent crime. 62% had a history of violence against the specific murder victim in question. You see why Maclean's didn't mention any of this? Because these are difficult, sensitive issues to solve. Much easier to blame racism, right? I am so sorry to say it, but the people who are killing and raping Aboriginal women are mainly Aboriginal men. And I say it only because Maclean's magazine spent 6,000 words implying that murdered Aboriginal women were murdered by white racism. This Maclean's article wasn't called Winnipeg, city where Aboriginal women are killed. It wasn't called Winnipeg, city where Aboriginals are poor or unemployed and we got to help them. Those are real problems, and a real brave investigation of them would have asked pointed questions for everyone from overpaid Indian chiefs on reserves to a justice system of white judges that explicitly gives Aboriginal criminals shorter sentencing, putting violent men back into communities where they can violate Aboriginal women again. No, this Maclean's article skipped over the hard parts. It skipped over a true assessment of the facts and the causes and jumped straight to its conclusion. All of this was because of white racism. And to prove that, I'll let you hear from a Winnipegger, radio host Dave Wheeler. He interviewed Nancy MacDonald, the reporter from Maclean's, and I want to play you some clips of it. I honestly cannot recall a more effective, more devastating interview in journalism. Wheeler starts off by talking about the murder of Tina Fontaine, really the central personality in the Maclean story. She was an Aboriginal woman who was murdered. We don't know by whom, but hey, those racist Winnipeggers probably did it, right?
Right off the top, you mentioned Tina Fontaine, which is an awful, awful, awful story. Do you believe that her death was a racist crime?
I think it was a crime that far too many women in that community experience, and it's of course it is a crime, but it's also a sociological phenomenon, and it points to something that's going very wrong.
So do you believe that her death was a racist crime?
I just don't think we know exactly what happened. The police are still investigating. They won't comment on what kind of progress they've made. I don't know. Was it a racist crime? I mean, we'll see.
So to lead the entire article with this horrific death, I mean, you read the title, Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst, and then you start with a story that is an unsolved crime.
So then Nancy MacDonald brought up another Aboriginal woman in her story who was violently attacked, Renelle Harper.
the day that Rennell Harper, who was sexually assaulted and thrown in the river, I mean, they were trying to kill her, spoke publicly for the first time, and she said, we need to talk about this. We need an inquiry to find out why so many women like me and girls like me are being murdered.
I'm glad you brought up Rennell Harper, because that's in the first few paragraphs as well of the story. And Rennell Harper, her attackers were Aboriginal. We know that for a fact. And we know that her saviors were two Caucasian men. Now, can you explain to me how that was racist?
Well, I think, for starters, I think Rennell was her own savior, and I think that that part of the story gets really gets missed in media. I mean, no, and I commend the two men who phoned police and
put a jacket over her and kept her warm and stayed with her until people showed up. I mean, that's not a very racist thing. That's the exact polar opposite of racism.
So Aboriginal men attacked her. White men saved her. So why is this an example, a proof point of how Winnipeggers are racist? Here's some more of that. I'll leave that to Wheeler.
You also mentioned Tanya Tagaq, who was last year's Polaris Music Prize winner, and you mentioned that she was down. She mentioned is here in the story. I'll quote you here. Winnipeg is where she was performing with City Hall's ballet this fall. A man started following me, calling me a sexy little Indian, and asking to f***. Now, one thing that you failed to mention in this is that the man that was saying these things was also Aboriginal. So, do you find it misleading to people to write, to leave that part out? Because, I mean, like reading it on the surface, one would automatically assume, oh, that must have been a white guy that said that.
I just said she was sexually harassed in the downtown core.
I'm trying to find that part here. It says here, they came after musician Tanya Tagaq, last year's Polaris Music Prize winner, who complained that while out to lunch in downtown Winnipeg, where she was performing with the city's ballet this fall, a man started following me, calling me a sexy little Indian, and asking to f***.
Yeah, so I was just trying to shine a light on the number of incidents that were happening in Winnipeg right in that short amount of time.
Right. So, I mean, I'm trying to understand how that was a racist incident.
I don't think I necessarily said that was a racist incident. It was an incident that happened
But I think when you're reading this, and when you read the title saying, Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst, and then the first three, out of three of the first five examples that you give aren't racist incidents.
It's painful. I'm cringing for her. I listened to the whole interview. I'd want to show it to you if we had time. I can't believe she agreed to go on the radio show in Winnipeg, where they actually know about Winnipeg. But listen to this. This is the last clip from the radio interview I want you to hear.
So the most multicultural city in all of Canada. Again, I don't think that's stressed enough in the article, talking about how good other races are doing in this city. They come here and they thrive. To me, that's not racist. A racist city wouldn't allow that to happen. Would you agree?
I think, the article was a response to a number of horrific events that happened this fall. And, we haven't talked about the election campaign. Robert Falcon-Ouellette, one of the mayoral contenders, faced a huge amount of racism, he tells us, on the campaign trail.
And finished third. And finished third.
Yeah, he...
And then a Métis mayor was elected. A Métis mayor was elected, which is... Would you consider that racist? Would a racist city elect a Métis mayor and have an Aboriginal guy come in third? Would a racist city do that?
I was talking about, racist incidents came to the fore during that campaign, and I think, I think it's amazing that Brian Bowman is mayor. I think he's done a phenomenal job handling this issue, and I think that real progress is possible under him. And I think Robert Falcon-Ouellette came out of nowhere. He was an academic prior to this. He's made a name for himself. He's going to run nationally, so I think these are all signs of progress.
So how is that a bad incident? To me,
as I mentioned in the article, it's about how things are changing in Winnipeg, and I think that these are all signs of the positive change that we're starting to see in Winnipeg.
Did you know that? Did you know that a cover story calling Winnipeg the most racist city in Canada is a story of positive change and great news? Well, why did she do it? I'm not even talking about her lack of research on things like education spending. Let's write that off to laziness. But how could she write about violence against Aboriginal women in a story about white racism when she knew the criminals weren't white? Why would she do that? Why would Macleans destroy their own credibility by letting her do that? Well, easy. Because you see, for liberals, especially white liberals, especially white liberals in Toronto who actually don't know a single Indian in real life. Blaming complex social problems in someone else's city on white racism is just a sign of your own righteousness. And it's a passive-aggressive way of saying, I may be a white liberal working at an all-white magazine, but I'm not racist. And I'll prove it to you by calling 750,000 people in another city racist. But that doesn't solve the problem, you see. In fact, it makes the problems in Winnipeg faced by Aboriginal women, makes them worse. By smearing open-minded, race-neutral Winnipeggers who regularly elect minorities to high office, Maclean's is actually sowing seeds of disharmony in a harmonious city. It's group slander. But more importantly, it's letting the real villains here off the hook. By inventing blame for racist whites, you let other real problems off the hook, from Indian chiefs who waste their band's money and allow unemployment and drug use to run rampant on their reserves, to our justice system that lets violent Aboriginal criminals go right back into the community to victimize their victims again. But hey, Nancy MacDonald, you finally made it big in Toronto, didn't you? More Source still ahead.